So, look, there's a lot, obviously, and this conversation's full of it that we agree on. But there's something that I do disagree about, and not with you in
Cool.
particular, but generally this whole anti-virology movement, because I think it's important for us to separate the fraudulent science from an understanding of life and living and physiology. I wrote an article about this not long ago and got a lot of mixed feedback. People who are insistent that I'm an idiot for not recognizing that viruses have not. No, I know, I get it. I understand that the thing that they claim to have isolated and that's causing disease ain't so. I get it. Okay. So let's dispense with the fraudulent science because I feel like it often contaminates what I'm after, which is trying to understand what the hell's going on with people and why they get sick and how to make them better. So this is the perspective that I'm approaching this from. All aspects of life that are ordered, that are not chaotic, from the physical to the celestial to the biological, they have a language that they use to order the things in their ecosystem. The easy way to think about this is computers have code. The way people think, we use language, the way we think and transmit thoughts and information. And so this opens the avenue for us to interpret what a computer virus might be, what a mind virus might be. There's pieces of information embedded in a vehicle, which is the language of that thing, that way of ordering things out of chaos, essentially, in this
Mm.
universe.
Yeah.
I believe that there's biological information. Whether or
Mm.
not you agree that there's DNA in a nucleus that is,
Mm.
let's forget about these abstractions or ways of looking at it and just think about it from a very procedural, I guess,
Mm.
perspective. There's information that organisms use to structure themselves, to regenerate themselves, to grow themselves, whatever.
Mm.
And humans are no different because we're also living organisms. What are the instruction sets and how are they transmitted
Mm.
within a cell?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there's obviously an information layer that's embedded in the language. And so from that perspective, we have to think, and I think this ties in very neatly into the misinterpretation of microscopy, electron microscopy, is
Mm.
because one of the things people will point to is, are you looking at a virus or are you looking at an exosome of a cell that's disintegrating because it's being met with all sorts of stressors from all the chemicals and whatever you're
Yeah.
putting on it? So from my perspective, what is viral information in the domain of biology? It is whatever structure is being used to encode the information transmitted by a vehicle. You
Yeah.
can think of this as a protein capsid, a lipoprotein, whatever it is, exosome, whatever word you want to use. It doesn't matter to me. Fundamentally, there's information that needs to be transmitted locally and at a distance. And so, from my perspective, viruses per se don't exist, but virality in the domain of biology does exist.
Mm.
And so, if it is true that information can be transmitted within an organism and across organisms, then the question is, how do we prepare ourselves if we're doctors or people who are trying to take care of ourselves or patients? How do we think about this?
Mm.
So what I would say is that there is information that can be detrimental to a human being, just like in the psyche or just like on a computer. There's information that can be detrimental if the terrain of where that information is transmitted isn't ready for it,
Mm.
it has its guard down, it's ill, there's something about it that's imbalanced. And this also lines up with what we see with not just virology, but all infectious diseases. Like most of the time, it's not the infectious agent that's killing the person, it's the person's unpreparedness in their response to that infectious agent that often
Yeah.
leads them to get sick. So
Yeah.
I think it's important to try to tie all this together into a framework or story that makes sense. Like
I agree.
if you work on a pig farm and there's pig shit everywhere, you better have very good hygiene practices or you're going to get sick. It doesn't matter
Mm.
what the thing is that's causing you to get sick. That's beyond the point. You're on a pig
Mm.
farm, there's shit everywhere, there's sewage. You have to have good hygiene practices. And this is where I also think that hygiene is a form of medicine. It's not just a thing that you do to present yourself to the world so you don't look like a schlub. You need to practice good hygiene. You're going to get sick.
Correct. Yeah.
So what do you think about that? Like, I'm not trying to say that viruses as they're being purported exist, or I believe in virology. I don't, frankly,
Yeah.
or infectious disease. I don't really. But I do think that there are these layers that we need to think about. And I remember once I brought this up to Mike in some like posts on Substack. We were commenting, and his conclusion was, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this was a few years ago. He was like, I see what you're saying, but this isn't, the battle that I'm having right now. I'm trying to bring
Yeah.
something else to people's, consciousness. And I get it, like that, totally
Yeah.
reasonable.
Yeah. No, there's a lot to unpack there, and these are great questions and great points of view. I um, we're all on a different journey, and I think that's what Mike said, isn't it? My end goal here is to make sure that 2020 never happens again, and my children aren't, ostracized from society. Past that, I have absolutely zero responsibility for anybody else's health. It's myself and my children's, and that's it. So your task is an incredible and a laudable one, and one that is filled with a little bit more complexity than mine, having a responsibility for others' health. So the few layers of complexity that are added to that make it slightly more difficult. And so to get into the more kind of finer details of what you said about information transferring, and I like the way that you framed it in the fact that we've talked about psychological, and we alluded to it earlier on, is that if you can transmit your thoughts and make people sick, if you can scare people and make people sick, then effectively you are transmitting disease. We have
Hmm.
to be honest about that.
Hmm.
So when I say, I'm quite specific with what I say, which is contagion of biological pathogens is a myth
Hmm.
or a hoax. I'm talking specifically about the things that they say are viruses, and I think that extends to bacteria and parasites. I say the viruses don't exist, and bacteria and parasites are just a product of your terrain, like maggots. If you put your hand in a bucket of maggots, it will do nothing. It doesn't eat live flesh. It only eats dead flesh. They are scavengers, and they mostly clean up the terrain that you're in, have byproducts of larger parasites, nutrient depleting nutrients, and in large scale infections, bacteria can complicate by their metabolites. But in general, contagion of biological pathogens is a myth. But what you touch upon is something a lot more visceral and deep, which is transmitting, disease via some sort of mechanism. And my work has led me through looking at the genetics part of it through PCR and going further. And obviously, what that brings forward, and this is where mainstream science says that the code is kept. The code for life is in your DNA, and this is how the world is built, from the building blocks, the A, T, C, and G code for everything that goes on within your life. And I believe that that's incorrect. I believe that DNA, if I'm honest, I believe that DNA doesn't exist. I think that it's a hoax. But the question that I get asked, and that it's something, so how does hereditary patterns work? It's the same thing with patterns of disease. So,
Yes.
information, there must be some sort of way that hereditary. I look like my dad. I look exactly like my dad.
Weird.
And that's something that I will say, I will just hold my hands up and say, I haven't really
No.
found anything, any kind of mechanism that to me makes sense yet. I could probably waffle on for about half an hour, and you can pick, some things, but I prefer to kind of let these things ruminate for a while,
Yeah.
before I
Yeah.
kind of stick my feet in the ground on them. But what I will
Yes.
say is that, and this is where I start my fundamental kind of looks into these things, is that every single practice test that I have looked into always ends in charge. It always, whether that be mass spec, whether that be the PCR test, gel electrophoresis, whether that be any single test within biology, ultimately measures charge.
Mm.
And if you're talking about cellular processes on the micro scale, even right the way through to the macro scale, and this can be backed up in some literature, and I follow in the footsteps of a wonderful lady called Eleni Papadopoulos Eliopoulos, who She challenged the HIV narrative and showed that HIV doesn't exist back in the 80s. And she's not so well known, but she did have a raft of work called the redox theory, which was looking at basically ionic changes on the cellular level within oncogenesis, within mitosis. And you can take this from muscle twitch fibers. So everybody knows you put uh, one of those ab packs on your abs and you turn it on and it makes your muscles contract,
Hmm.
or a stun gun or whatever, muscles quite obviously work through electrical charge.
Yeah.
You put a charge in one end and they contract and you take it away and they uncontract. And when you study that on any level, it works right the way down to, as you would imagine, the cellular level where inducing charge causes mitosis. When you can turn it cancerous, when you can encourage mitosis, when you can proliferate these things in a petri dish, which we were doing in cell culture, you cut a thing out of a human being, which is what we were doing in the Virology Control Studies project. They cut them out of a human being in the 1950s, put them cryogenically, freeze them, and you can take them out of that freezer 50, 100 years later and regrow them by putting some cow's blood as nutrients around
Hmm.
them. Okay. And you can see
Yeah.
them and they grow and they proliferate. Really, if they were that complex, I don't think that you could be able to be growing these things so easily. I think that the cell, the basic fundamental part of the human being, is just that. It's a cell. It's a physical positive, negative. And when you, just like a computer, it's fundamentalist, and I call this simplex. Okay. It's a simplex picture. At its fundamental, a computer is just one or zero. It's on or off, or it's binary code. But the reason why we can be having this discussion today in a different continent, you know, with all of this technology around us, is because there's trillions upon trillions of these tiny little interactions all happening at the same time. It's a simplex. It's simple at its core, but complex in the way that it manifests. And
Hmm.
I think that the body is no different. It's very simple at its core with these tiny little cells that are all just on or off, alive or dead, oncogenic or mitosis. It's no much more complex than that. But the complex picture is how this interacts on the macro level. When you have trillions of these things all interacting together, what state are they in? Are they in a hard, difficult, toxic state where they're in a stone in a gallbladder, or are they free flying and running and moving like water within a blood vessel?
Navigating this is very difficult for a lot of people, and that's one of the reasons why I write, and one of the reasons that I thought it's very useful to have these kinds of conversations with people. But just to kind of give you a little bit more context where I think this might be a good frame, story, narrative, is everywhere I'm looking now with this new lens, I'm like, oh, that makes sense now. Or I'll give you an example. Why is it that when people get a flu shot, which is purported to be fragments of influenza causing biological matter, why do they get a flu-like syndrome? Or why is it that when people get a shingles vaccine, why do they get shingles? Or why is it that those people that were involved in the Rosen experiment of transmitting the cold, they didn't get sick no matter what you gave them?
Mm.
In the one case, let's say the people that didn't get sick, they were fit, young, healthy, in good spirits, and idealistic. So their body was ready for the information without it overwhelming them. On the other hand, who's given shingles and flu vaccines more regularly than anyone else? Older, frail, or immunocompromised people. And then they get the thing that biological information is encoding, speak. This is such basic science and empiricism. The more explanatory power your story has, maybe it's approximating the truth. And this is why I
Interesting.
think it goes back to virology and these other disciplines as being pseudoscientific, is that they're dressed in science, but they explain almost nothing, not
Yeah.
completely. And
Yeah.
so they're not truly empirical, and they are not approximating reality. And so that's why I think this is something worth considering, whether you're a virology, antivirology, or anywhere in between. It's like, okay, like what is getting back to helping us navigate the world in a way that's responsible for me, for my family, or if you're a doctor, your patients. That's what I will leave you with.